Deep inside your brain sits a collection of structures, which is the reason why you doomscroll. It is evolutionarily old and doesn't care about your goals, diet, or your morning routine. It's called the limbic system, and it operates on one currency: survival. This system has a seismic grip on your emotions, fear responses, your drive for food, sex, and even social connections. It makes decisions based on one question: does this feel good or does this feel threatening? That's it. As stated in the name, the limbic system is a neighborhood of all the parts of your brain that are responsible for instincts, emotion, drive for food, etc. And at the heart of the neighborhood lives the nucleus accumbens, where the emotions turn into actions. This is a part of the brain where dopamine processing happens, and dopamine activity in this area is what makes us feel good.
And dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter that regulates pleasure in the brain. So there's this part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and when dopamine activity happens there, it's one of the ways in which we feel pleasure. It's like the pleasure center of our brain. If we look at a lot of drugs of abuse like cocaine and amphetamines and things like that, those stimulant drugs tend to directly increase dopamine in our brain, which makes us feel good and euphoric.
Now, the nucleus accumbens doesn't work alone. It's what creates the want to go on your phone, but what makes the cycle last so long? We begin with an instinct to feel good, but we stay because we are emotionally incapacitated. The more rise and fall in emotions we experience, the more we are susceptible to dopaminergic activity in the nucleus accumbens. Social media is incredible at stirring the pot of emotions. It will show you something sad, and then something funny, and then something terrifying, and then something sad again. This emotional dysregulation is the reason why doom scrolling is so dopaminergic.
So let's talk about our second part of the brain. So here's the nucleus accumbens, and now we're going to talk about the amygdala and the limbic system. So this system is very important for dopamine vulnerability. So the more negative emotion we are dealing with, the more vulnerable we are to dopaminergic signals from the nucleus accumbens. So these two parts of the brain talk to each other a lot. There are a lot of connections between the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala. The worse we feel, if I'm feeling depressed, if I'm feeling anxious, I'm more vulnerable to dopaminergic activities. Because what we know is that dopamine basically shuts off negative emotion. And negative emotion induces cravings for dopamine because we feel bad when we have negative emotions, right?
Since social media is such a high dopaminergic activity, it takes up all your store of dopamine and you have nothing left to pursue other things that take sustained effort.
So think about it like a lemon that you're squeezing the juice out of, right? So the more you squeeze, at the very beginning, you can squeeze very little and you can get a lot of juice out. But at the very end, you need something very, very powerful to squeeze out the remaining juice. So the more dopaminergic the activity, the less dopamine you need to engage in the activities. And I don't know if this kind of makes sense to you, but when you feel really tired and you don't feel motivated and you don't feel like doing anything, what are the only actions that you can take? The lower your energy level is, the easier it is to engage in dopaminergic activities, because these will squeeze out the last bit of dopamine that is left in your brain, because they're very powerful pulls of dopamine. Let's say we start out our day and we engage in an action like a video game. Now remember, this is a powerful squeeze. So now we have a full lemon and we are squeezing very tightly. What's gonna happen to our dopaminergic signal? We're gonna actually empty our whole swath of dopamine because we've got a full lemon and we have a powerful squeeze. If you want to engage in sustained effort with low rewards, we need to have a lot of dopamine in reserve.
This connection between the limbic system and the nucleus accumbens worked great back when humans were still hunter-gatherers. That was back when there was real danger, and emotional cues were a reliable indicator of the world around you. But that is no longer the case. Software engineers figured out this loophole, and they use it to garner attention to their platforms. The people building these platforms know exactly what they're doing. In 2017, Sean Parker, who was the first president of Facebook, sat down for an interview and said this about the platform that he helped build.
You know, if the thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them to really understand it, that thought process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you, more likes and comments. I mean, it's a social validation feedback loop that it's like it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology.
That was Sean Parker, the first president of Facebook. What he's saying may not be any news today, but that interview was 8 years ago. For the longest time, companies have been trying to optimize their algorithm to attract as much of the viewership for as much time as possible.
It's sad to me because it's happening not by accident, but by design. Because the business model is to keep people engaged, which in other words, this hearing is about persuasive technology. And persuasion is about an invisible asymmetry of power. So let's walk through why that's happening. In the race for attention, because there's only so much attention, companies have to get more of it by being more and more aggressive. I call it the race to the bottom of the brainstem. So it starts with techniques like pull to refresh. So you pull to refresh your newsfeed. That operates like a slot machine. It has the same kind of addictive qualities that keep people in Las Vegas hooked to the slot machine. Other examples are removing stopping cues. So if I take the bottom out of this glass and I keep refilling the water or the wine, you won't know when to stop drinking. So that's what happens with infinitely scrolling feeds. We naturally remove the stopping cues, and this is what keeps people scrolling. But the race for attention has to get more and more aggressive. And so it's not enough just to get your behavior and predict what will take your behavior. We have to predict how to keep you hooked in a different way. And so it crawled deeper down the brainstem into our social validation. So that was the introduction of likes and followers. How many followers do I have? And that got it was much cheaper to, instead of getting your attention, to get you addicted to getting attention from other people.
Now think about your Instagram feed. Every slot is a pull of the lever, like a slot machine. Sometimes you get something amazing, a video that makes you laugh, news that shock you, maybe something that even moves you. Sometimes you get nothing. The infinite scroll has no natural stopping point. Autoplay decides to play the video before you even decide to watch it. Notification badges are red dots that your brain reads as urgency. Like counts are social validations delivered in bursts. Every single one of these features was deliberately engineered using the same psychological principles used to design casinos.
And in the race for attention, it's not enough just to get people addicted to attention. The race has to migrate to AI. Who can build a better predictive model of your behavior? And so if you give an example of YouTube, so there you are, you're about to hit play on a YouTube video, and you hit play, and then you think you're going to watch this one video, and then you wake up 2 hours later and say, oh my God, what just happened? And the answer is because you had a supercomputer pointed at your brain. And at the moment you hit play, it wakes up an avatar voodoo doll-like version of you inside of a Google server. And that avatar, based on all the clicks and likes and everything you've ever made, those are like your hair clippings and toenail clippings and nail filings that make the avatar look and act more and more like you. So that inside of a Google server, they can simulate more and more possibilities. If I prick you with this video, if I prick you with this video, how long would you stay? And the business model is simply what maximizes watch time. This leads to the kind of algorithmic extremism that you've pointed out. And it's a race between Facebook's voodoo doll, where you flick your finger, can they predict what to show you next, and Google's voodoo doll. And these are abstract metaphors that apply to the whole tech industry, where it's a race between who can better predict your behavior.
But before you go down another rabbit hole, I'd like to remind you that hope is not lost. There's another system in our brain. And this is the reason why humans were able to achieve great things despite the presence of the limbic system. This is your prefrontal cortex, where the rational and the goal-oriented side of you lives. This is responsible for executive function, long-term planning, and impulse control. This was developed evolutionarily later, and also happens to consume a lot more calories, which makes it slower than the limbic system. And it also happens to get tired quicker. For the most part, the fast limbic system and the slow prefrontal cortex served us quite well. We needed to act quickly based on how we felt. So in emotional situations, your prefrontal cortex would almost always lose to the limbic system.
The next circuit that we're going to talk about is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is part of our frontal lobes, and our frontal lobes are what generate things like willpower, right? So when we do things like meditate, the frontal lobes are basically what control the other parts of our brain. So if you're feeling really, really emotional and there's this voice in your brain that says, get it together, buddy, let's calm down, we need to focus. Or if you're trying to study. And so your brain is like, instead of getting distracted, let's focus. That's all done by your frontal lobes. So the other thing that the prefrontal cortex does is generate value assessments. So anytime you're thinking about doing an action, your brain has some idea of what the action is worth, right? What the value of the action is.
Check this out. Brain rot was named the Oxford Word of the Year in 2024, referring to the cognitive decline and mental exhaustion experienced by individuals, and particularly adolescents and young adults, from low-quality online material. This sounds kind of edgy, but I'd argue that it's not really a cognitive decline. Your brain is plastic enough roughly till you're the age of 25, and the more you expose it to something, the more it will adapt to it. If you spend hours consuming content in 15-second bursts, your brain restructures itself to prefer that kind of input. Sustained effort becomes neurologically uncomfortable. Things like reading a book, sitting in a lecture, or paying attention in a meeting, they all become harder. Not because you're lazy, but because you've trained your brain out of it. So while you're not necessarily losing IQ points, you are losing the ability to pursue sustained effort in low dopaminergic activities. So how do you actually fix it? Getting trapped in social media depends on how quickly the algorithm can spin your wheel of emotions and give you a taste of everything that's on the menu. Taking back agency of your emotions is the quickest way to get out of that cycle. To improve how you feel, you need to start working on your negative emotions. It seems kind of obvious, but there is a lot of neuroscience behind that. You need to become resistant to high dopaminergic activity.
So what we really want to do, if y'all are struggling to control your motivation and you're not motivated to do what you should really start to work on your negative emotions. So we can do all kinds of emotional processing activities. This can be things like therapy or journaling, meditation, right? And some of y'all may be saying, okay, so Dr. K, you just saying that I should journal and meditate and go to therapy. Oh my God, you've said it a million times. Oh my God. Yes, but this is the main thing to understand. It's not about engaging these activities because they're good for you. The thing to understand is that if you want to be able to control your dopamine circuitry, you have to understand what the inputs are and understand that the more depressed you are, the more anxious you are, the more you will wind up addicted to dopaminergic stuff. So you must deal with those negative emotions.
Your phone isn't going anywhere, and these platforms aren't going anywhere. But there is a difference between using a tool and being used by one. Technology today has a seismic grip on our nervous system that makes us feel lonely and isolated when we get off it. It's grown to replace the validation and comfort we would otherwise receive from our loved ones and from our community. Soon, the introduction of a virtual playground will start to replace the real world. But whenever you get stuck in a scroll, tap into that feeling at the back of your mind that remembers what it felt like to be outside. And maybe, just maybe, it'll be enough to remind you of the things that really matter.
To believe. I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. But I don't have to know an answer. I don't feel frightened by not knowing things. By being lost in the mysterious universe without having any purpose, which is the way it really is as far as I can tell, possibly. It doesn't frighten me.